Welcome to Love Beyond Midnight. This is a fictional story crafted for your entertainment. He found her dying in the snow on what should have been the happiest day of her life.
She was still wearing the wedding dress when Adrian found her collapsed in the snow. The fabric had turned gray from the slush, the delicate lace torn at the hem where she'd clearly been running. Her lips held a blue tint that made Adrian's chest constrict with something he hadn't felt in years. Genuine fear for another person's life. He knelt beside her, his expensive coat immediately soaking through at the knees, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. The pulse was there, faint but steady, like a whispered secret against his fingertips. "Get the physician," Adrian barked at his groundskeeper Thomas, who'd followed him out into the December night. Now. He didn't wait for a response. Adrian gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. The wedding gown was elaborate, the kind that cost more than most families earned in a year, but it was soaked through and provided no warmth. As he carried her toward Thornmere Hall, her head lolled against his shoulder, and he caught the scent of orange blossoms mixed with something sharper. Fear, perhaps, or the acrid smell of smoke that clung to the expensive silk. Adrian Blackwood had not touched another person with tenderness in 3 years. Not since the trial. Not since his name had been dragged through every London drawing room as the man who'd destroyed the Ashford family fortune. The Duke of Thornmere had become synonymous with cruelty, with calculated revenge, with the kind of cold-blooded business dealings that left men ruined and their daughters without dowries. And yet here he was, cradling a stranger in a wedding dress, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. The servants scattered like startled birds when he kicked open the main doors. Mrs. Garrett, his housekeeper, was the first to recover, her weathered face shifting from shock to efficient action in the span of a heartbeat. "The blue room," Adrian commanded, already moving toward the stairs. "Hot water, blankets, and someone find me every dry towel in this house. Your Grace, should we not—" "Now, Mrs. Garrett." The housekeeper had worked for the Blackwood family for 30 years. She knew when to ask questions and when to simply obey. This was decidedly the latter. Adrian laid the woman on the 4-poster bed in the guest room, his movements careful despite the urgency thundering through his veins. In the lamplight, he could see her face properly for the first time. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair that had fallen loose from its elaborate styling. There was a bruise forming along her left cheekbone, purple and angry against pale skin. Someone had struck her. The realization settled in Adrian's stomach like a stone in deep water. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize the marks it left behind. This wasn't from a fall. This was from someone's closed fist. "Who did this to you?" he murmured, more to himself than to her unconscious form. Mrs. Garrett bustled in with 2 maids carrying armfuls of blankets and towels. They worked with practiced efficiency, removing the sodden wedding gown with the clinical detachment of women who'd seen their share of emergencies. Adrian turned away, giving the stranger her dignity, but not before he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wedding ring on her left hand was engraved. He'd only glimpsed it for a second, but the design was unmistakable. 3 interlocking serpents, the crest of the Ashford family, the same family he'd destroyed. Adrian walked to the window, his reflection a dark silhouette against the frost-covered glass. 3 years ago, he'd used every legal and financial weapon at his disposal to dismantle Edward Ashford's empire. The man had betrayed Adrian's father in a business deal that had led to the elder Blackwood's death, a heart seizure brought on by the stress of sudden bankruptcy. Adrian had been methodical in his revenge. He'd bought up Ashford's debts, called in favors, used his title and connections to ensure that every door in London society closed in Edward Ashford's face. He'd wanted the man to feel what his father had felt, the crushing weight of financial ruin, the humiliation of social exile, the bitter taste of powerlessness. But he'd never intended for it to touch Ashford's daughter. According to the rumors that had reached even his isolated estate, Catherine Ashford had been engaged to some minor baronet, a match arranged hastily after her father's fall from grace. A marriage of necessity rather than affection, designed to salvage what little remained of the family's reputation. Was this her? Had something gone so terribly wrong at the wedding that she'd fled into a winter storm still wearing her bridal gown? Your Grace, Dr. Morrison's voice cut through Adrian's spiraling thoughts. The elderly physician stood in the doorway, his medical bag clutched in gnarled fingers. I came as quickly as I could. Adrian stepped aside, allowing the doctor access to his patient. He should leave. This was no longer his concern. He'd done his duty as a gentleman by bringing her inside, by summoning medical help. Whatever drama had driven her out into the snow was her own affair. Yet his feet remained rooted to the floor. Dr. Morrison worked in silence, checking her pulse, her breathing, the temperature of her skin. After what felt like an eternity, he straightened, his expression grave. She'll live, but it was a near thing. Another hour in that cold, and we'd be having a very different conversation. He paused, his rheumy eyes meeting Adrian's. She's also been injured. The bruising on her face and torso suggests she took quite a beating before she ended up on your doorstep. How long until she wakes? Could be hours, could be tomorrow morning. The body shuts down when it's that cold. It's a mercy, really. Gives it time to recover. Dr. Morrison closed his bag with a decisive snap. I'll return in the morning to check on her. In the meantime, keep her warm and dry. If she wakes, try to get some warm broth into her. After the doctor left, Adrian found himself alone in the room with the sleeping stranger. Mrs. Garrett had changed her into one of the household's spare nightgowns, and someone had brushed out her dark hair so it spread across the pillow like spilled ink. She looked peaceful now, almost serene, so different from the broken figure he'd found in the snow. Then Adrian pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, knowing he should leave, but unable to make himself do it. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, those 3 serpents seeming to mock him with their eternal motion. If this was Catherine Ashford, if his revenge had somehow led to this moment, then he owed her more than just medical care. He owed her answers. He owed her truth. But more than that, sitting in the quiet darkness of Thornmere Hall, with only the sound of her breathing for company, Adrian realized something that terrified him more than any business negotiation or social confrontation ever had. He wanted to know her story, not as the daughter of his enemy, not as a symbol of his revenge, but as the woman who'd been brave enough, or desperate enough, to run into a winter storm in a wedding dress rather than face whatever waited for her at the altar. And that wanting, that curiosity, that flicker of something warm in the cold fortress he'd built around his heart, felt like the most dangerous thing of all. Catherine Ashford woke to the smell of lavender and beeswax, scent so far removed from the chaos of her last conscious moments that for a heartbeat, she thought perhaps she'd died. Heaven, she'd been told as a child, smelled of flowers and light. But then pain bloomed across her ribs like fire spreading through dry kindling, and she knew with certainty that the dead felt nothing. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft morning light filtering through velvet curtains the color of storm clouds. The room was unfamiliar, too grand to be an inn, too personal to be a hospital. Oil paintings lined the walls, pastoral scenes of rolling hills and distant manor houses. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she'd known in the past year, since her father's creditors had stripped their London townhouse of every comfort. "You're awake." The voice came from her left, deep and measured, carrying an edge of something Catherine couldn't quite identify. Concern, perhaps, or curiosity. She turned her head, ignoring the protest of muscles that felt like they'd been trampled by horses, and found herself looking at a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the winter landscape outside. He sat in a leather wingback chair positioned beside her bed, his posture rigid despite the early hour. Dark hair fell across a face that was handsome in the way of sharp things, cutting cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of slate before a storm. He wore no jacket, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat, as though he'd been sitting there long enough to abandon formality. "Where am I?" Catherine's voice came out rough, like she'd been screaming. Perhaps she had. The memories were fragments, jagged pieces that cut when she tried to assemble them into something coherent. "Thornmere Hall," he paused, watching her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "My estate. You collapsed in the snow outside my gates last night." Thornmere. The name struck her like a physical blow, and Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that name. Every person in London with even a passing interest in society gossip knew that name. The Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Thornmere, the man who'd destroyed her father. "I see you recognize the name." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret. "Though I confess I'm at a disadvantage. I know the ring you wear, but not the woman wearing it." Catherine's hand instinctively moved to cover the wedding band, that circle of gold that felt like a shackle rather than a promise. The three serpents pressed against her palm, cold and accusatory. "Catherine," she whispered, because there seemed little point in lying. "Catherine Ashford." If she'd expected shock or anger, she was disappointed. Adrian Blackwood merely nodded, as though confirming something he'd already suspected. "Edward Ashford's daughter." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Which begs the question, what were you running from so desperately that you chose a winter storm over your own wedding?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine could feel the weight of it, the way it pressed against all the carefully constructed walls she'd built around the truth of yesterday. Because how did you explain to the man who'd orchestrated your family's downfall that his revenge had set in motion something far worse than financial ruin? "I wasn't running from the wedding," Catherine said finally, her voice steadier now. "I was running from my husband." Something changed in Adrian's face then, a hardening around the eyes that suggested violence barely restrained. The bruises. It wasn't a question, but Catherine nodded anyway. Her hand drifted to her cheek, feeling the tender skin beneath her fingertips. She'd seen her reflection in a window during the ceremony, had watched the purple bloom across her face like spilled wine on white linen. Baron Whitmore has particular ideas about obedience. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. I disagreed with one of them. He felt it necessary to educate me on my new duties as his wife. During the wedding, Adrian's voice was very quiet, but Catherine heard the rage beneath it, controlled and cold as the winter outside. After, during the breakfast, Catherine closed her eyes, but that only made the memories sharper, more vivid. He'd been drinking since dawn. Said it was his right as a husband to discipline his wife, that my father had assured him I was tractable despite my unfortunate circumstances. When I objected, when I suggested that perhaps striking one's bride at the wedding breakfast was poor form, She stopped, unable to continue. The memory of Whitmore's fist connecting with her ribs, the shocked gasps of the assembled guests, her father's face, pale and sweating, and utterly indifferent to her pain. It all crashed over her like a wave. "He what?" Adrian's voice cut through the spiral of remembering. "He said worse was coming, that the wedding night would teach me properly. And my father," Catherine opened her eyes, meeting Adrian's gaze directly. My father told him to do whatever was necessary to make me compliant, that I'd always been too headstrong, too opinionated for a woman, that Whitmore had his full blessing to break me of such habits. The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine watched emotions flicker across Adrian Blackwood's face. Fury, disgust, something that might have been guilt. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window, with the coiled energy of a predator in a cage. So you ran. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I ran, Catherine confirmed. I waited until they were distracted by the toasts, until Whitmore was deep in his cups and bragging to his friends about the wedding night to come. I walked out the servants' entrance, and I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. You could have frozen to death. I know. Catherine's voice was calm, accepting. It seemed preferable to the alternative. Adrian turned from the window, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Your father sold you to a monster to pay his debts. It should have been a question, but Catherine heard the certainty in it. She wondered what Adrian Blackwood saw when he looked at her, the daughter of his enemy, a victim of his revenge, or simply a woman who'd made the same choice he might have made in her position. Baron Whitmore offered a generous settlement, Catherine said, each word carefully chosen. Enough to keep my father from debtor's prison. Enough to maintain a small household in the country, away from London's prying eyes. All he wanted in return was a wife with an acceptable name, however tarnished, and the understanding that I would ask no questions about how he spent his time or his fortune. And when you questioned him anyway, he showed me exactly what my questions were worth. Catherine sat up slowly, when ignoring the sharp protest of her bruised ribs. She needed to see Adrian's face clearly, needed to understand what was happening behind those stormy eyes. Why did you bring me inside? Why didn't you simply send me on my way? The question seemed to surprise him. Adrian crossed back to the chair but didn't sit, standing instead with one hand gripping the leather back. Because leaving a woman to die in the snow isn't revenge, he said quietly. It's murder. And despite what London society might believe about me, I'm not a murderer. Just a destroyer of families. Catherine hadn't meant to say it, but the words emerged anyway, sharp and bitter. She expected anger, perhaps denial. Instead, Adrian Blackwood did something that shocked her far more than any outburst could have. He laughed. It was a harsh sound, empty of humor, but genuine nonetheless. Yes, he said simply. I destroyed your father's business empire. I used every connection, every legal maneuver, every ounce of influence I possessed to see Edward Ashford ruined. And I would do it again. The honesty was brutal, refreshing in its cruelty. Catherine found herself studying this man who'd orchestrated her family's downfall with new eyes. There was no apology in his stance, no regret in his voice. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. What did my father do to earn such hatred? Adrian's expression shifted, and for the first time since she'd woken, Catherine saw something other than controlled composure. She saw pain, old and deep, and never properly healed. He killed my father. The words fell between them like stones into still water. Not with his own hands, perhaps, but with his betrayal. They were partners, your father and mine. They'd built an empire together, trusted each other with everything. And then Edward Ashford decided he wanted it all for himself. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard whispers about a business dispute, about partnerships dissolved, but never this. Never murder. He forged documents, manipulated ledgers, convinced investors that my father was embezzling from their own company. Adrian's voice was steady, but his hands had curled into fists. My father was an honest man, Catherine. Too honest. When he discovered the forgeries, when he confronted your father, Edward denied everything, turned it back on him. Made it seem like my father was the one guilty of fraud. My father wouldn't. Your father destroyed mine. Adrian's voice cut through her denial like a blade through silk. The scandal, the accusations, the social exile. It was too much for a man who'd built his entire life on honor and trust. He had a seizure in his study 3 weeks after the allegations went public. I found him there, collapsed beside his desk, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. He died in my arms, still trying to tell me the truth about Edward Ashford. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and Catherine gripped the blankets to steady herself. Her father, charming, affable Edward Ashford, capable of such calculated cruelty. It should have been impossible to believe, but she thought of how easily he'd handed her over to Whitmore, how little he'd cared when his new son-in-law had struck his daughter at her own wedding breakfast. Perhaps she'd never really known her father at all. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but they were all Catherine had. I didn't know. He never told me about your father, about what happened. Why would he? Adrian's voice had lost some of its sharp edge. Hardly old enough to be involved in business matters. Old enough to deserve the truth. Edward Ashford isn't a man who believes in truth. Adrian finally sat, the fight seeming to drain from his posture. Any more than he believes in protecting his daughter from monsters. They sat in silence, two people bound together by revenge and circumstance, neither quite sure what came next. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. She was married now, legally bound to Baron Whitmore. She had no money, no prospects, nowhere to go. Her father had made it clear she was no longer his concern. And the man sitting before her, the man who'd saved her life, was the architect of her family's destruction. What happens now? Catherine asked, voicing the question that hung between them like morning fog. Adrian met her eyes, and Catherine saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Not fear this time, but anticipation. Whatever he was about to say would change everything. Now, Adrian said, his voice low and deliberate, you tell me everything about Baron Whitmore. Every detail, every cruelty, every secret. Because I built my reputation on destroying men who deserve it. And if your husband is half the monster you suggest, so then he just became my new project. Catherine stared at him, understanding blooming like fire in her chest. Adrian Blackwood wasn't offering her charity or pity. He was offering her something far more dangerous. He was offering her revenge. And what do you want in return? Catherine asked, because men like Adrian Blackwood never gave without taking. What price for helping destroy my husband? Adrian stood, moving to the door with that predatory grace she was beginning to recognize. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her with eyes that held secrets and promises in equal measure. The truth, Catherine Ashford. His smile was sharp enough to cut. I want you to tell me everything your father never did. Every lie, every manipulation, every carefully hidden sin. Because I destroyed Edward Ashford's fortune, but I never touched his most precious possession. His daughter, Catherine whispered, understanding flooding through her. His daughter, Adrian confirmed. And now his daughter is going to help me finish what I started. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Catherine alone with the weight of impossible choices and dangerous alliances. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Thornmere Hall in a blanket of white that felt less like peace and more like the calm before something far more devastating. Catherine Ashford had run from one monster only to strike a bargain with another, and somewhere in the cold chambers of her bruised heart, she found she didn't care. 3 weeks passed, like pages turning in a book Catherine had never wanted to read, but couldn't put down. She told Adrian everything. Not all at once, but in careful conversations held in his study, while winter storms battered the windows and fires crackled in hearths throughout Thornmere Hall. She told him about her father's gambling debts, about the servants dismissed without references, about her mother's jewelry sold piece by piece, until there was nothing left but shame and empty velvet boxes. She told him about Whitmore's visits during the courtship, how his charm had curdled into threats the moment her father left them alone, how he'd made it clear that her consent was irrelevant, that she was property being transferred from one man to another. And Adrian listened. More than that, he recorded every detail in a leather journal that grew thicker with each passing day. But something unexpected happened during those conversations. Between the revelations about her father's crimes and Whitmore's cruelties, Catherine discovered the man behind the Duke's cold reputation. She learned that Adrian played piano, though he claimed he'd forgotten how. She discovered he took his coffee black because his father had, a small ritual of remembrance he maintained without sentimentality. She found that he had a sharp wit buried beneath layers of controlled composure, and that when he laughed, truly laughed, not that harsh, empty sound, it transformed his entire face into something warm and genuine. And Adrian, for his part, seemed to be discovering something too. Catherine caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unguarded, in ways she suspected he didn't realize. When she played chess with him in the evenings, he smiled at her clever strategies. When she argued about politics or literature, he engaged rather than dismissed. When she walked the frost-covered gardens wrapped in borrowed furs, he appeared at her side as though he'd simply been passing by, though they both knew Thornmere's gardens weren't on the way to anywhere. On the morning of the 21st day, Adrian summoned her to his study with unusual formality. Catherine entered, to find him standing behind his massive oak desk, several documents spread before him like cards in a game of chance. "It's done," he said without preamble. "Baron Whitmore has been exposed." Catherine's heart stuttered. "How?" "Your husband has a weakness for cards and other men's wives." Adrian's voice was clinical, but his eyes held a glint of satisfaction. It took very little effort to document both. I had investigators follow him for 2 weeks. The evidence of his adultery is irrefutable, enough to grant you an annulment on grounds of fraud. He married you under false pretenses, claiming to be a man of honor when he was maintaining 3 separate mistresses and a gambling debt that rivals your father's at its worst. An annulment. Catherine spoke the word like it was foreign, something she'd learned but never expected to use. In their world, marriages didn't end. Women endured, or they were ruined. There was no third option. "The paperwork is already filed with the ecclesiastical court. Whitmore's reputation is destroyed. His debts are being called in by creditors I may have quietly contacted, and he'll be lucky to avoid debtor's prison himself." Adrian paused, his expression softening slightly. "You're free, Catherine." Free. The word should have filled her with joy, with relief. Instead, Catherine felt only a strange hollowness, as though something essential had been carved out and taken away. "And my father?" "Your father sold his daughter to a monster and watched her be beaten without intervention." Adrian's voice hardened. "I've made it known in certain circles exactly what kind of man Edward Ashford truly is. He'll find no welcome in London society, no credit from any reputable institution. He has enough to live on, but his days of influence are finished." Justice, Catherine thought. This was justice. So why did it feel incomplete? "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done. I know I have no right to your help, given my family's crimes against yours. You have every right." Adrian moved around the desk, but stopping a few feet from where she stood. You're not responsible for your father's sins any more than I should be punished for mine. You have no sins. The words escaped before Catherine could stop them. You sought justice for your father. That's not the same as what mine did. Isn't it? Adrian's laugh was bitter. I destroyed your family's fortune knowing it would hurt innocent people. Your mother, you, the servants who depended on that household. I told myself it was justice, but revenge and justice aren't always the same thing. Catherine stepped closer, drawn by something she didn't fully understand. In 3 weeks, this man had become familiar in ways that should have taken years. She knew how he took his tea, how he rubbed his temples when he was tired, how his voice softened when he spoke about his father. She knew the weight of his grief and the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his life. And she knew, with sudden clarity, that she didn't want to leave. What if, Catherine said slowly, testing each word before speaking it, what if justice and revenge could become something else entirely? Adrian's eyes met hers, and Catherine saw understanding bloom there alongside something warmer, more dangerous. Catherine! Her name on his lips sounded like a warning and a promise. Don't confuse gratitude for something more. You're free now. You can rebuild your life anywhere, become anyone. You don't owe me anything. I know I don't owe you. Catherine closed the remaining distance between them, her heart hammering against her ribs. But what if I want to stay anyway? Not because of revenge or justice or debt, but because these past 3 weeks have been the first time I've felt like myself since my father's fall. Because you listen when I speak. Because you make me laugh. Because when I think about leaving Thornmere Hall, about never seeing you again, it feels like walking back into that winter storm. You barely know me. But Adrian's hand had risen to cup her face, his thumb gentle against the fading bruise on her cheek. I know enough. Catherine leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin. I know you're a good man who did a terrible thing for the right reasons. I know you saved my life when you had no obligation to. I know that somewhere between revenge and redemption, we found something neither of us was looking for. And what's that? Adrian's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. A second chance. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like Catherine had expected. Not demanding or claiming, but questioning, asking permission with every gentle pressure. Adrian kissed her like she was something precious, something worth the careful handling. And Catherine felt 3 years of cold isolation crack and fall away like ice in spring. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing like they'd run a great distance. Stay, he said simply. Not as an obligation or out of gratitude. Stay because you want to. Stay, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that revenge can transform into something better. Something real. Catherine smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Yes. One word, but it contained multitudes. Yes to staying. So yes to second chances. Yes to the terrifying possibility of happiness after loss. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds, painting Thornmere Hall in shades of gold and silver. In the study, 2 people who'd been brought together by revenge stood holding each other, choosing love over the ghosts of their pasts. 6 months later, Catherine Ashford became Adrian Blackwood, in a small ceremony, attended by friends who understood that the best marriages were built on truth rather than illusion. They honeymooned in Italy, where Adrian taught Catherine to play piano, and she taught him to let go of control long enough to dance in the rain. And when they returned to Thornmere Hall, it was no longer a fortress of isolation, but a home filled with laughter and music and the kind of love that grows from choosing each other every single day. The Duke had found his enemy's bride left in the cold, and he'd made a choice no one expected, including himself. He'd chosen forgiveness over revenge, love over hatred, and in doing so, found the one thing his carefully constructed plans had never accounted for. He found home